Okay, here we are back at COP28 live, and as luck would have it, I've just bumped into none other than Johan Rockström, the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Johan, thanks so much for joining us at sudden short notice. We're talking at a great time. We're in the final run-in for this COP. The talk now is really about phase down or phase out of fossil fuels. How important is it that this is the COP that we see a phase out of fossil fuels?
Ever since the last COP, we've been in very intensive discussions with this COP presidency, with the United Nations Framework Convention, that this is the moment to really take the mitigation agenda seriously. It's the first COP hosted by an oil and gas nation. The presidency is held by the CEO of a state oil and gas company. It's therefore a great responsibility to really convene and get a plan for the phase out of fossil fuel. So get a credible, so not only a statement on phase down or phase out. I would argue that that's kind of an academic question today. What we need is a really concrete plan of what happens between now and 2025, when we need to bend the global curve of emissions. What happens between 25 and 2030, when we need to cut global emissions by half and reduce emissions with a pace of 6 to 7% per year for all fossil fuels globally, and then cut emissions by half every decade to reach a point by 2050, which basically has a full phase out of coal, but still certainly will have a phase down of oil and gas, because we have so many difficult to abate industries that then needs to be compensated with carbon dioxide removal. We have provided numerous scientific technical notes into the negotiations on exactly this matter, spelling out what the IPCC, then the Governmental Panel on Climate Change says. So I think we are really clear today scientifically what needs to happen on this pathway. 2050 is a milestone. That's not the end of it. The key is to recognize that we're talking about full phase out, but if that phase out occurs 2050 or 2055 or 2060 is secondary. The key is to cut global emissions for all fossil fuels by half by 2030. Why? Well, because scientifically we know that holding 1.5 degrees Celsius is not a target or a goal, it's a physical limit. Go beyond it and we risk not only unmanageable impacts from climate extremes like droughts, floods, fires and disease on millions of people around the world, but also that we risk crossing tipping points, causing irreversible damage to the life support on planet Earth. So it's a really hard limit, and it translates to a carbon budget, which was released here just 2 days ago, the 2023 update. We only have 250 billion tons of carbon dioxide remaining that we can allow ourselves to emit from fossil fuel burning and land use change to have a 50% chance of holding 1.5. And that is such a minuscule budget, and everything that counts is the area under the curve. So the pathway can be calculated, and that's the pathway that takes us to 50% by 2030. So, phase out or phase down is, of course, a question that needs to be sorted here in Dubai. But what we expect, and what I think everyone here should expect, is a plan. And that plan has to be not a one-sentence plan, it has to be a 2-page plan, which spells out what should happen in regions, in sectors, for the 3 different fuels: oil, coal and gas. And how do you do it in a way that not only follows the pace that science stipulates is necessary, 6-7% per year of decline, but also how do you actually mobilize not only the finance to enable that transition technologically and economically, but how do you enable a soft landing? How do you ensure that the vast majority of economies around the world don't collapse on this journey? We know that once we're out of this gauntlet, this period of transition, we are very likely to be winners, that the world comes out with a cleaner, more efficient, cheaper, economically more competitive energy system. But the transition will be challenging, undoubtedly, and it will be challenging also because we have delayed so much that the speed by which this has to happen is so high now. But that's where we are, and that's what COP28 is really fundamentally about, getting that credible mitigation plan.
Thank you. You answered most of my questions that I had there. The only other one I had was really bringing this back round to business. A lot of edie's community have, over the last couple of years, established net zero targets, fairly ambitious net zero targets. I wanted to get your thoughts on the concept of net zero generally, because from the scientific community there's some backlash against net zero. It maybe is a little bit disconnected from the real ambitions that we need to see here. And again, to your point about maybe a lack of actual concrete plans, we're seeing that a little bit with businesses. What's your take on the kind of net zero movement and where it stands at the moment?
Yeah, so just like fossil fuel phase out or phase down, net zero, absolute zero is something that it is quite murky and grey, and my conclusion is that it is murky and grey just because the realities are complicated. You know, I wish I could say that all science shows unequivocally that we need to reach absolute zero. It would be the simplest, most straightforward message. But the reality is that if you cut something by half every decade, there will be a residual by 2050. And that residual is feedstocks in industry from natural gas. It is the need to use natural gas for difficult to abate industries, but also recognizing its use in fertilizer production. You will have some residual parts of the economy that still run on fossil fuels by 2050. So there is an argument to be made that net zero, even though it creates this opens a door for misuse, there is very little evidence that you can entirely kind of omit it. But there's a simple way of dealing with this, which is to create different carbon account buckets. So you have one carbon account bucket, which is the remaining carbon budget, the 250 billion tons of carbon dioxide that we can allow ourselves to emit for an orderly phase out. Then you have the carbon bucket on carbon dioxide removal technologies, the technologies that need to be invested in industry to take out, to compensate for the difficult to abate, the net zero part. So by 2050, there will be a special carbon accounting, there should be a special carbon accounting. If you have still 5 billion tons of carbon dioxide in oil and gas, you have to take that out so that you are at net zero by 2050. But then you have a third technological carbon account, which is we know that you also have to start scaling different forms of negative emission technologies so that the whole world economy becomes a negative, sucks up more than it emits. That is well beyond the net zero point. So it's not about compensating oil and gas and coal that is still out there. It is about really sucking out in an absolute way so that we enter the second half of this century is a net absorber of carbon. We're sucking out carbon. And then finally, there's a whole bucket on nature. And that bucket should be kept apart. So you cannot use tree planting or regenerative agriculture as a way of saying that's what helps me to get to net zero. So I continue my oil and gas emissions and then I compensate for that by planting trees. That does not work because the climate models that gives us bucket one, the fossil fuel remaining carbon budget, the models have already assumed that nature will provide a carbon sink of roughly 50% of what we are emitting. So that bucket is already accounted for. It's already factored in. We simply need to deliver that one and the phase out bucket. So net zero, yes, for some residual, additional technologies needed to suck that out, but we also need to scale negative emission technologies and we need to take care of nature. And we have to do everything simultaneously. And then anyone who listens to this will say, oh my God, that sounds like overly complex. Well, I can just say, dear friends, the planet is a complex system. And we have, created havoc to an extent that we now need so much repair that it's time to recognize that we need to work along all these lines of action and that there are multiple carbon budgets that need to be respected. You cannot offset them against each other. So it's not so simple to say, I dislike net zero, so therefore I'm simply against it. One has to go into the details and recognize that some part of abatement will be required.
Johan, thank you so much. I know you need to run. I have literally stopped you on the way to one of your many events you're speaking at. So thank you so much. And thanks everyone at home for watching. I'll see who else I can bump into here at COP28.